Hello and welcome back. This is Cheryl and I'm glad you're here. In this video I'm going to show you how to create a color changer card that has a slider that you pull directly out. Now the bonus to this is when it pulls out you can display your card, whereas the one that I showed on the previous one, because the slider doesn't pull out, it's a little bit harder to display. So the very first step is I'm going to cut an oval into the front of my card for my frame. In this card, I'm going to do a poinsettia design, and I want to emboss it on the front of the card as well as the inside and the acetate for the slider. So I wanted to cut the oval ahead of time so that I didn't affect the embossing when I went to cut that shape out. So I'm going to put my oval front into my stamp positioner, and I'm lining it up at the 1 inch line so that I can have my poinsettia stamp a little bit off of the front of my card. I'm going to stamp it with Versamark ink, and then I'm going to emboss it with gold embossing powder just to give it a little bit of an extra touch, a little bit more festive for Christmas. So I'm putting my powder on the Versamark ink. If you've never embossed before, Versamark ink is a sticky ink that powder is going to stick to while I'm using the embossing gun to melt the powder on that ink. So you want to hold your embossing gun away from your hands because it does get quite hot. And you'll see it go from kind of a dull gold color to shiny gold when it melts. Now I'm doing the same step on some watercolor paper because I'm going to watercolor the image on the inside of the card. So I'm stamping with Versamark ink again, and then I'm also going to emboss with gold embossing powder. And once again, as you saw, lining it up with that 1 inch mark because I want all of my images to match to create the color changer card. Now this is watercolor paper because I'm decided I'm going to watercolor my image. You can use whatever coloring medium you would like to color your image. If you want to use Copics, you can use Copics. Just be careful of the gold embossing powder. If you want to color with Tombow markers, any form of coloring will work for this card. But because I'm watercoloring, I chose watercolor paper. Now I have my heat resistant acetate. Because I'm embossing the gold or the image in gold on everything, you need to use heat resistant embossing powder, or sorry, heat resistant acetate. Now it is heat resistant, it's not heat proof. So when I go to emboss it, I'm moving my heat gun around regularly, not keeping it in one spot because the acetate will warp if it gets too hot. So just be sure to keep moving it around, and you'll notice that I'm moving it around a lot more than I was moving it around with any of those papers. And that's just to help it not to warp. Once it is embossed, that can be set aside for later. First step is to watercolor the image. I'm just using Distress Reinkers to watercolor my images, and I'm using Festive Berries, and then I'm also using aged Mahogany for the darker areas. And then at the end, in the center of the poinsettia, I'm going to use some mustard seed. Now I'll just let you watch the watercoloring. I do have it sped up just so that it doesn't take quite as long. And you'll notice I'm doing one petal at a time. I'm doing the darker area where one petal goes behind another petal, and then the lighter area is the tip of the petal. to create a channel for our slider to move, I'm creating a U-shaped channel in the background of the card. So I'm putting some adhesive down. I've got some 1/4-inch strips of the same cardstock as the card base, and I'm going to work in, for the first layer, I'm going to go from left, bottom, and right, and then the other layer, next layer, I'm going to do right, bottom, left, just so that my seams aren't all in the same spot. And I'm going to do 3 high so that I have enough space for my slider to move in and out evenly in my card. Once those channels are in place, I'm ready to cut my watercolor piece down a little bit. Now, because everything was the same size and was stamped in the same spot when I started, I want to make sure to take off just a little bit over 1/4 inch. And I'm just checking there just to make sure that all my stamped images are lining up. I'm leaving a little tiny bit of wiggle room so I can move my image because I want all of the lines of the poinsettia stamp to match up perfectly. Once I know that everything's going to be able to match up perfectly, gluing down the watercolored poinsettia on the center of the card within those channel from the 1/4 inch strips that we created. And I'm going to let that dry. Once again, just double checking to make sure everything matches. And you can shimmy if it needs to be moved just a tiny little bit. So the slider piece for the card needs to fit within that channel as well. So I'm just cutting a touch off of that just to make sure that it can fit within that channel. And then I'm going to take a pencil and I'm going to mark where the top of the card is on that slider. I have a little bit extra at the end that I'm going to create a pull tab with. And I'm going to take a slide rule trimmer. A guillotine trimmer will not work for this. You need something that has a blade that you can move. And I'm going to cut in to about 2 inches, lift the panel up or the blade up, and then I'm going to cut the rest, leaving about a 1/2 inch that I didn't cut. I cut that out of the video because I put my head in front of the camera and you actually didn't see it. So now I'm taking a corner rounder, rounding those edges, and then I'm just testing my slider just to make sure that it fits properly. Now I'm going to put that acetate piece and glue it to the front of the card. So I'm just using some double-sided tape, and I'm going to put 2 layers, one close to the opening of the center of the card, the oval opening, and then one around the edges. And I'm going to carefully put that onto my acetate piece and make sure that all of my stamped and embossed lines match perfectly. You definitely want to make sure to take your time putting the frame onto the acetate and just make sure that everything matches up exactly. So next we're going to put some adhesive on the top of that U-shaped channel that we created, and then we are going to match our front of our card onto the watercolor image. Once again, making sure that all of the lines match. So you'll notice after I put the adhesive on the channels, I'm lifting just part of it up, And that's so that I can match part of it and then release the adhesive a little bit at a time, just so that everything doesn't shift. If I took the backing off the adhesive and then tried to match the entire thing, chances are something would have stuck to adhesive, making it a little bit harder. But by doing a little bit at a time, I can make sure that everything stays lined up as I'm attaching it. Once I have those lines all lined up, I'm going to press down where I know the exposed adhesive is, and then I'm going to hold it still while I release the rest of it and hold or attach the rest of the front to the front of the card. This is something that you definitely want to take your time doing and not rushing. And you also want to hold it down gently so that you do have, there's not too much pressure that you can't remove that adhesive. Once we have that attached, we can put our slider in there and just test it out, make sure everything is perfect. Now, I wanted to put a little bit of a greeting on the front, so I took Merry Christmas die cut it out of a shiny gold mirror paper, and I'm just carefully putting adhesive on the back and gluing that to the front. This is just going to put a little bit more sparkle to the front of our card, just make it a little bit more festive, simply because that image in the center is not very interesting to look at. So this is just going to give it a little bit of extra. Once I have that placed where I want to, I usually use an acrylic block just to hold it down. That way I don't have to sit and hold it. Also testing out that slider. Now, the bonus of having the slider that comes completely out is that you can display this card. Now, the best way to display it is to attach it to a card base. So once I have my stickles, I'm just putting some gold stickles in the center of the poinsettia. I'm going to work on my card base. My card is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, including that tab at the top. And without that, it's 5 1/4 by 4 1/4. So I have a card base that is that same size. I'm going to stamp and emboss a Christmas sentiment in the center of it. And once that is done, I'm going to glue it to the front of a card and then glue the card front to the card base, the back. And then I'm going to put an acrylic block on there just to hold it in place with some weights so that it can dry perfectly and nice and flat. Now that everything is completely dry, there's our completed card. Stands up nicely to display. That insert can be taken right out. It can also be put right back in if you want it to go back in. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I hope you have a fabulous day.